Yeah, good morning. Right, I'm going to take you through Screen Age Kids. It's probably quite obvious that it's a play on teenage kicks. And just for your own amusement, when you go through it, there's quite a lot of song titles that you can pick out if you feel like it. And I don't know, I keep thinking this is sort of picture of olden times, you know, when kids were allowed to roam the streets, find wolves to wee up, before they were kind of confined to screens and being in the house. It's the golden age. But anyway, and what I should say, of course, is we've done this in the last 12 weeks. This is very much a summary of the results. There is a full deck available. You can have the tabulations, everything else. If you're interested, just let me know. And Savanta, the online panel company, were kind enough to join us in doing this. So, why did we do it? Well, we are not an insult. I keep saying insult. I try and say insight. We used to be a market research company, but we're not anymore. We're an insight consultancy company. So, at the start of this year, we did a NatRet study amongst UK 16 plus, 2,000 people, and it was on the use of VOD and where they saw it going in the future and how they were making choices. And then sort of trying to work out whether there was space for more VOD services, where SVOD things, etc. And what that ended up doing was, it was that survey that got us thinking about the younger audience. And there's one particular question which struck us as quite significant. And we thought what we'd really like to do is we'd like to test this amongst the 5 to 15-year-olds rather than just the group that we have now. And I'll show you that question because I'm quite proud of it, but we'll get to it in a moment. So what did we do? We spoke to 1,000 children, 5 to 15. Now, the one thing I will make a significant point of is that we spoke to 5 to 8-year-olds with parents, so they completed the survey. So whenever I'm talking about that, I'm talking about the parents completing it. When we go past that, I'm talking about the kids completing it. There is some interesting differences in the way that they understand the question that's being asked and the way that they respond, and I'll come to that as well. It is NatRep in the sense that it's NatRep by key demographics. There's no attitudinal stuff in there, but it is basically age within gender by region. And we did 2 versions. So before we go on, let's talk about what we asked them, because we thought it was important to define this, and we ran it a few times and tested it, not just in this survey, but other surveys. When we say these things and they read them, are they understanding what we want them to understand? So video content services, any kind of online platform. I'll be honest, when I started, I wanted them to think about video content services full stop, including broadcasters, the more traditional. But that didn't happen. As soon as you say video content, they think online. SVOD services refers to the paid services. And it became quite clear as we went through that whenever we talk about SVOD, regardless of, even if they had more than one service, they would just talk about Netflix. Videos on demand is your catch-up players, so that's your VOD. It is a limitation of those services, is that's how they're seen by the consumers. It's not seen as somewhere where you might go and explore content to a great deal, or you might go and binge for a period of time. It is basically somewhere you might go and catch up. And then the online streaming. And once again, it says e.g. YouTube, but we actually had more examples. Vimeo was in there, trying to kind of get people to think broader than that, but no, everyone's going to think about YouTube. So first of all, let's talk about the choices that they make. So I guess if we were going to look at 3 C's, we were looking at, let's talk about choice, let's talk about control, and let's talk about content. So who makes the choices, who has control over what they're doing, and what type of content are they actually deciding to watch? So, first of all, and this is the question that got us excited when we got the Vodacy report, which is also available, by the way, just let me know. Of the Vodacy report, there was a question which said, when you're looking to watch something, sit down and relax, where do you always go to first? Always go to first, sometimes go to first, never go to first. Now, the slightly older looking chap over here is from the Vodacy report, and he was 2 in 5 are saying that they always go to live TV first. And live TV was defined as somewhere where you'd sit down as it was live and watch it. Only 10% of our 5 to 15-year-olds would also always go first to live TV. Now that's what makes this question good and what makes it interesting isn't the fact that that is exactly what they do, but that tells us how they're the hierarchy of the services within their mind. So they're sitting around and say, you always go to first. Well, I always go to the SVOD service, or always go to the online streaming service, because that's the one that's more significant in their minds. Because when we do ask where they go to first, SVOD, I want the new go-to for the young. And okay, I know it's early, etc., but the more alert of you will say 22% versus 24%. Actually, what you're really saying is YouTube, Vimeo, that's where they end up going for online streaming. But there is subtlety in the different age groups. So of the top one, as soon as you get to your 13 to 15-year-olds, you start to get, so all the way through up to 12, it's online streaming and YouTube that comes first. As soon as you get on to the 13, 14 and 15-year-olds, and there's sort of quite significant changes in their lives and their interests, etc., that's when you get a big skew towards the SVOD services. And if we go and look at the 16 to 19-year-olds, we've got 40% of them saying that they'd always go to an SVOD service first. So it's sort of the journey starts at this point, and it does seem that the tipping point for that is around 15 years of age. So how are they finding out about it? Well, self-exploration. They explore the videos themselves, and there's an awful lot of freedom involved, and this is where we end up moving into the idea of control and choice. So when you're asked, where do you find out about these things? Well, I'm allowed to explore. And this is shown for all our sample 5 to 15-year-olds, but that was the number one answer regardless of age. So even your 6-year-olds are basically exploring videos themselves as they go through the service. Recommendations from friends, and it's not just that, because people aren't just saying they get recommendations from friends, they're also saying they're the person that starts the conversation, but I'll come to that in a moment. And I don't know, it's reassuring for me to see only 1 in 5 would actually take any recommendations from their parents. My 8-year-old certainly would not. So what does it actually mean? Well, SVOD streaming services are replacing live TV as the go-to for the younger audience. That's not to say that live TV is irrelevant, and we'll come on to some interesting facts about that soon. But it is to say that that is where their mind is being able to control what they're able to watch and choose, and actually trawl through a very big library. So we'll see what happens as things change. And it is self-exploration, which is parents giving quite a lot of freedom to their children to go through the services, which also, I think, gives some responsibility to the SVOD services and online streaming services. And broadcasters could learn an awful lot from the digital services in terms of trying to work out how best to present themselves, because it is all about perception. It was yesterday that I noticed another thing that Amazon actually has a more extensive library than Netflix, but you would never know that if you were to talk to anyone. It's just the idea that if you can go through Netflix, it's so well and easy to discover stuff. It just gives you a whole kind of journey. So who calls the shots? I didn't expect this to do exactly what it did, but I called it Pester Power because the question was, who do they have a say and an influence? So not just an influence, to come back to the point that Fred was making, that if in your younger households, you are going to have more content services because you are targeting the ones that will provide content for your kids. So suddenly you become a Sky subscriber, suddenly you get Netflix, you get Amazon, because you want that entertainment for your children. Everyone needs a babysitter. But this is actually saying that 56%, and this goes all the way down, it's the same for the 5 to 8-year-old parents, are quite happy to say that their 5 to 8-year-old has not just influence but also a say on the type of services that come into their household. Okay. That's giving them an element of freedom, or giving them a feeling that they've got an element of freedom. But who's really in control? I wonder whether time limitations are a very simple way to convince yourself that you're in some way controlling your child's viewing habits. So all the way across, it's up to 90%, up to your 12-year-olds, and then you get your 60% there saying that their time is limited on any device. The device that is most limited is your games console and your smartphone, I think, as you would expect. But it's the same across all. And are they supervising them? Or who takes responsibility? So 9 out of 10 of the parents say that it's their responsibility to manage their child's viewing. But are they only managing their child's viewing by saying, well, I can limit the time that they're on a particular device? Because that seems to be the kind of acceptance of what I'm doing. I'm doing something as a parent because I'm limiting it. 2 in 5, though, of teenagers, so our teenagers, don't forget, are 13, 14 and 15, are saying that they're supervised on YouTube, Netflix and catch-up. So they're at least supervised in some way. Okay, this is them saying it. So how does that break out? If we look at the different services, and I don't want to say it's not true. So you get a perception, or there's a feeling. When I first saw this, I did not expect the VOD services to be as supervised as you would see something for YouTube or see something for the SVOD players, based on the fact that you would expect some kind of legacy trust agreement going on. But there isn't. So if you look at your 5 to 8-year-olds, 94% of them get their YouTube supervised, down to your VOD service, which is your middle one, which of course is your iPlayers and your ITV hubs. You've still got 9 in 5, and it goes to 85%. We also asked them later on a question about who do you trust? Which of these services do you trust? Or how do you rate them? And if you look at the 5 to 8-year-olds, so the parents answering, those responses in terms of supervision absolutely match what they say in terms of trust. So only 30-odd% of them trust YouTube, 40-odd% of them trust the VOD services, and 65% say they trust Netflix or the SVOD. When you get to your 13 to your 15-year-olds, and they're saying this is how much I'm supervised, and YouTube is the least supervised of all of them, but then of course you've got to take into account the way that you consume these different services. So YouTube is much more of a solo activity, so it's harder to supervise than something you're sitting around your television, so take that into account. And when they're asked about trust, it's basically YouTube and Netflix and the BVOD that they don't trust. So when they talk about trust, they're not answering trust in the same way their parents are talking about trust. Trust is more for them, and it is something it'd be nice to explore a bit more detail, would seem to be more about relevance, in the sense of what I can trust it to deliver, what I want it to deliver, rather than I trust it to look after me. And just looking at Netflix, it's absolutely the same story across the whole way. And Netflix Kids Domain, I'd be interested to know how many parents keep their kind of younger children within the Kids Domain and who are quite happy to let them kind of explore, because as you'll see later on, parents are quite happy to say that they let their kids watch programs that are targeted for older kids. And especially when you get to your 13 to your 15-year-olds that are answering themselves, they're saying a lot of the time they're watching content which is targeted at older children than themselves. So how much are parents concerned about what they're exposed to is a question I'd like to ask. And also later on find out exactly where that tipping point comes. But anyway, so that is... And when we talk about supervision, of course, we asked a thing about their activities, which I'm not going to show you, but I'll just mention it, in terms of their regular activities. And it was really your 13 to 15 is when they move away from the family, not in the sense they don't like their family, but they move away from the family and start hanging out with friends much more, and there's much more freedom. So therefore, to supervise your 13 to 15-year-old is a much harder thing to do. And they're having lots of conversations, and you can't clearly supervise conversations unless you're one of those weird parents. But word of mouth becomes incredibly significant, because not only are they having conversations about it, they want to be the person that's starting that conversation. They want to be the person that shares that information. I like to be the person that tells my friends about new content, which means having content they can talk about is very important. And up to 8 years of age, it's your SVOD services that provide that content. Once you go past that, it's YouTube. So YouTube provides that kind of... And this is the dilemma. We didn't include things like Snapchat, etc., and other things where you can do video services, social media, because YouTube is that kind of... Is it a video? It's a video sharing service. Great, yeah, but it's also a social media service that kind of crosses both of those over, which makes it quite difficult to, I guess, define totally. But what you get with this group as well, and it's worth saying, because once again, it's your 13 to 15-year-olds, and you can sit there and go, well, they're looking for stories. We don't know that, but we can make that kind of assumption possibly, is that YouTube's perceived best, but once you get to 13 to 15-year-olds, the gap between the Netflix and YouTube is about 2%. So up until there, you're looking at a really big gap between the two of them. Once you get to 13 to 15, it's much closer. And this is the point I was making about the much too young. Are they watching content which is targeted at older children. Yes, 53%. And that felt quite honest in a world where we all like to judge people, it seems, whether social media or the Daily Mail. 53% say that they allow their children to watch content which is targeted at older children. I'm less surprised that 3/4 of the older, our teenage group, are happy to say so. Should we be concerned about that? Possibly. Because not only are they watching content that's targeted at older children, they're doing it in situations where they're doing it in isolation. And the isolation grows as they get older. But even the darker bar is our 5 to 8 year olds, the bright orangey bar, yellow, is our 13 to 15 year olds. But even 5 to 8, or half of them are watching Netflix alone a lot of the time, 42% are watching the VOD services, but it's really YouTube, and goes up to 84% of YouTube. And they're not just watching it alone, they're not even watching it in the same room, our 13 to 15 year olds. The black line and the yellow line, you've got your living room and in my bedroom. So obviously there is no point, whether it be your weekday or your weekend school day, that they're more likely to be watching these services in their lounge than they are going to be watching them in their bedroom. So who's really in control? Well, kids get quite a lot of freedom. There is sort of some limitation in the sense that I'm going to manage how much time you have on that device. I might not actually supervise what you're doing on it, but I will manage the time that you have on it. But then autoplay comes into effect. So you go all the way around, so the kids have got a bit of control, the parents have got a bit of control. But what can the service do? Well, the service can keep playing things to the children. They keep playing things to the children. That takes them into a place where they find it difficult to stop. So that is a sense of there is a sort of responsibility, I would say, in the sense of what comes up. So what are we saying? Well, parents do have a level of control, but I think it's a trade-off, isn't it? And I mean, as a parent, you're probably quite happy to make that trade-off. I sort of give you a sense, but I don't want... We have lots of debates about it's a changing world. You should have this amount of time on your screen. No, screen time won't hurt you. Yes, it will hurt them. No, they shouldn't be watching this, or they should be watching that. And as a parent, you don't really know, but you want your child to be kind of aware of the things that the other children in the playground are aware of. So how much freedom do you give them and how much freedom do you not give them is a constant dilemma. So a little bit of balance of, I'll give you this, but make sure we check on this. Empower me. So this was one of the very first questions, and it was an open-ended question. And what I really wanted to do, what I was hoping that would happen, is they would think more than just about the online services. But I didn't want them to think about TV channels, so I avoided using the verb TV. But when you go through it, the average mentions for YouTube across all ages in terms of being the video, and this is what they're writing down, is 67%. It's 45% for Netflix across all the ages. But once again, you'll see I'm going to make the same point. Your 13 to 15-year-olds are much more likely to say Netflix, and they get much closer to YouTube. So if anything, you kind of get quite an early kind of SVOD Netflix, then it goes out to YouTube, then it comes back in again. And they're doing it a lot. In terms of regular, and I suppose there's always different definitions of regular, but of all our sample, around 80% would classify themselves as regular users of YouTube. Now, sorry.
You're talking about YouTube. Are you talking about YouTube or YouTube Kids, or are they together?
Just YouTube.
So you're looking at the 13 above platform.
Now, with YouTube Kids, we talked generally about YouTube. We didn't define whether it would be the kids one or just the general YouTube one. From my very small sample, of course, and I wouldn't like to make it representative, I find it very difficult to keep my child on YouTube Kids, because there's certain things that are on YouTube that are not offensive, i.e. top 10s. Someone might say bloody. I don't care, he's 8. If he wants to hear someone say bloody, he can. But that won't be available on YouTube Kids. So you kind of give them that little bit more freedom. And I think this is where you keep trying to balance whether you give them a little freedom or not. But to answer your question, without going on a tangent, no. Watch at least every day, watch at least every other day is 3 in 5. And that's of all our samples. So it's not the regular users, that's just of every single person. And half of them are watching it every day. And why are they watching it? It's not just about the fact that there's loads of content, because there obviously is. but it's the relevance of the content to the children. And it's relevant because it enables them to start conversations. Certain things that they can see themselves in. When we had discussions about doing this, because it was something we were going to do, and then we were chatting to the conference guys about different types of issues that they thought we should think about. And so we tried to put them in. And one of them very much was about the type of content. So is it British or US content that they should be looking for? Is there a sense that we should be representing the children's lives within the content that they're seeing? From this research, no one really cares. The kids certainly don't care, and the parents don't either, in terms of where it's from. As long as it entertains and it feels relevant to them, then they're quite happy for them to have it. And this is what we're talking about. So what happens is, right at the start, it is about the fact I want something that has the largest selection of content. Goes up to half of those of 13 to 15-year-olds. 35% agree that it's content I can relate to is important, and that jumps up to over half of your 13 to 15-year-olds. And that surprised me, that relevance came higher than amount of content. If you were going to choose one service that they felt was most relevant and also had the most selection of content, well, YouTube comes out 55%. So it has the biggest selection of content, and I think more striking, 63% say it has content that's relevant to them. And that goes up higher for your 13 to 15-year-olds. And we asked lots of questions about content, I mean, within the confines of our 10-minute questionnaire. It's quite a difficult subject to really pin down in terms of trying to work out, because we're sitting there going, there's so much content, there's content that's relatable to me, that I can relate to, etc. So this is a very brief summary, but we've got a lot more data on all types of different content. You know, we've sort of tried to do the YouTube content, the SVOD content, the British content, etc. So there's a lot of information there, and once again, you're welcome to have it. I don't know, if I could have changed it, but you guys wouldn't let me, I wouldn't call it a war. But anyway, YouTube, I basically have the most content, or perceive to have the most content and the most relative content. And when it comes to the type of things they're watching, they're not watching episodes or programs, etc. in the top 5. These are the top 5. They're watching music videos, gaming videos, how-to video, life hacks, etc., all the way down to vlogs. And this is, I think, where the relevance comes, in the sense of they can sit down and look at someone that they can actually relate to and feels not too far away from them when they're talking to them. 5 to 8-year-olds, cartoons and animations. Well, there is Twyman's law of courses in research. If there's something that you think is really surprising, it's probably wrong. So I quite like it when I get things that look really boring and obvious, like 5 to 8-year-olds like to watch cartoons and animations. Good. If it said something else, I'd have been a bit more worried. And then your catch-up services, those VOD services are seen as somewhere where you go for British content, but there isn't a big drive to do so, and the British content is the catch-up. So I'm going to watch X Factor. I didn't see it on Saturday, I'm going to watch it on Wednesday or whenever it's on, and etc. Same for Love Island and all that sort of stuff. So live TV is still really important, and the reason I would say that is because when in our questionnaire we had a list of channels. So at one point we asked them how regularly they did something, and only about 40% said they regularly watch TV as a definition. But later on, we asked them, which of these TV channels have you watched in the last 7 days, which feels quite regular. Up to 90%, so between 80 and 90% across all the age groups had watched one of those listed TV channels in the past 7 days. So live TV was still very relevant for them, but it wasn't relevant in the sense of their hierarchy of their minds of services. So it's something they use, it's just not top of mind. But that does mean that may well change, and you do need to start, it is a case of you have to provide some kind of service which gives the control. So kids constantly believe they're in control of their watching habits. So what does it mean? What do we know? We know that control is shared between parents, and they have the freedom to explore, and they have quite a lot of freedom, but there's a sense of give them enough rope maybe. Content needs to be perceived as never-ending, and that constant exploration, and the ones that are doing that very well are the ones that are perceived to have the most content and have the most relatable content to the kids. And they want a lot. So we did ask, and it is a blunt question, how interested would you be in an age-appropriate, a service which was age-appropriate for yourself as an SVOD service? I was surprised the figures were so high, but this is saying they're very quiet or very quite interested. Even we've got over half of our 13 to 15-year-olds are saying that they're very or quite interested in such a service. It was quite a basic explanation. But within the Vodacy report, which we also talked about things like BritBox and other SVOD services, it was clear from that there is a space still for these, it's not a case of, I was discussing it with someone, it's like, well, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not. People do stack, they make choices, and they sort of switch between different services depending on what their current needs are. Whether that will survive the launch of 3 or 4 new services, and some of them are actually going to be taking a lot of the libraries from other services, is a question we can't answer in this research, but it'd be quite interesting to find out. Because that self-explanation, if there isn't so much to explore, then it's not so much fun to do it, is it? And it becomes a bit more limited. So that's going to impact it, and that just means that YouTube's the one that's going to become more significant. Is there a story-led aggregator out there as they're getting older? Your 13 to 15-year-olds are looking for things that are less, YouTube-focused and more into the idea of your SVOD episodic stuff. And if you can't win, then is there more? Is it a niche service? Is it a specialist service, etc. that will do the job? Thank you. Yeah, a tad rude. It was a 5-year-old, not me. But anyway, thank you.
Sorry, when you asked your target group when they watch terrestrial channels, did you differentiate between watching that on catch up or watching it live? Just because I know that if you'd ask my daughter, she'd definitely watch Love Island, but she wouldn't watch it live.
No, we specified live. Okay. The question was, when did you last watch? Which of these channels have you watched when it was broadcast live on the TV in the past 7 days? Something like that. Maybe not as clunky, but very close to.
Hi, I'd like to ask, did you have any insight on any other questions if there's new platforms like TikTok, Twitch, InstaTV and others that are rising? Because I think we're already kind of talking about Netflix and YouTube, but the kids they are looking at new platforms all the time.
I would have loved to. And I do think it's a really sort of significant thing, especially, not just that, the other ones as well. But it's that it's just like where I was sitting with YouTube, it's trying to draw that line between saying that we're talking about a sort of VOD service or we're talking about something that's more of a social media service like TikTok, which I know you post videos on, my son's obsessed. And that becomes so, I think there's a study, there's probably a study looking at that more than looking at this part of it. So we stuck it very much in terms of content. Mm-hmm. So, no.
Okay, thanks.
Hi.
Oh,
hello.
I can't see back there.
Hi.
Old eyes.
Did you ask any questions about the platforms that use advertising and the ones that don't, and whether that creates impact on their preference?
We did in the Vodacy study. So in the larger adult study, we did a whole bit about advertising and whether they accept it within a VOD service and what type of service they would accept the advertising in. It's an interesting question with obviously Comcast, Universal's kind of AVOD model, but within this one we didn't. On the top of my head, in terms of the Vodacy stuff, somewhere that isn't offering advertising and they start to push advertising onto it, that would be a serious issue, especially if you're paying for the service. In the same way, if you're used to getting something in a certain way and then you're being forced to change, so when newspapers gave all their news away for free and then suddenly expected people to pay and say, well, that's not fair, you're not paying for it. Well, that's because you gave it to free. So with the SVOD, with the VOD services, if you have something that comes in, I think, like an AVOD service that says this is what we're going to do, then that sort of sets people up and they know what they're going to expect. If you then were to bring one in and start introducing it, I think that would be the data says that would be a serious issue for them.
Because Prime are trialling it now, aren't they? So on their own shows. So I expect it to come. I work in advertising, so hooray!
I think it will come. No, I think you're absolutely right. Which is why we asked in the Vodacy one with the adults. With this one, I thought about it, but just didn't feel the right. With the parents, with the other kids, I'm not sure.
Cool. Thank you.
But if you want that Vodacy data, just let me know. You're welcome.